Finding. I hope not. Ooh, getting the beard in my mouth. I want Kit Kat, not hair. What? There's more? Yeah. There we are. Okay. Okay, good to see you all again. Happy belated St. Patrick's Day. So we're continuing to talk about the church today. Hopefully I'll finish talking about the church today, God willing. Help me out, St. Patrick. Yes, Titus. I stopped talking about Titus. I was going on to Timothy. Okie dokie. So we're talking about church structures, or the church in general, what the church is, and then I was talking about church structures, and the church has a structured reality. I showed you that video from the movie Jesus Christ Superstar. Why did I show that to you? Because what's coming up in the Christian calendar? Does anybody know? Some special holiday coming up that might be related to the video that I showed you? Yes? No? Mr. Coons? Easter, yes, good. Easter is eventually coming up, which is what, Mr. Coons? What is it a celebration of?
Well, the resurrection.
The resurrection. Okay, the word Easter is an old English word, which simply, I think it means springtime. It's not a religious term, but it's the day of the Lord's resurrection. Yeah. Well, okay, that's a good answer, sir, because yes, that is coming up at the end of next week, after Holy Week, but what's coming up more immediately, which might be related to the video that I showed you? What's coming up more immediately? What will some Christians, not all Christians, but certainly Roman Catholic Christians will be celebrating this in a few days.
Good Friday.
Huh?
Good Friday.
Good Friday, yes. And what is celebrated on Good Friday? The crucifixion, yes, on Good Friday, or as Eastern Christians call it, Great and Holy Friday. We got Mr. Grimaldi, we got Mr. Kushner. Hello, gentlemen. Happy belated St. Patrick's Day. You're welcome, sir. But before that, Ms. Cibarelli, there's something that's going to be celebrated. A week before the day of the Lord's resurrection, there's kind of like an anticipation of Easter Sunday, when even the Passion story, even Good Friday, where at the Roman Catholic Church they will read and kind of act out in a way the Passion story, the story of the trial, the arrest, crucifixion of Jesus, not the resurrection, because that comes on Easter Sunday, but they won't talk about it. So they kind of anticipate almost a week before Good Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday. Yes. Palm Sunday, yes, that's what I'm looking for, because maybe you noticed in the movie clip that people were waving palms, yes? From a palm tree, okay? Which is just a sign of respect and, I guess, celebration. So, yes, you might have noticed what they were saying when they were singing, Jesus, it's from the 70s, and so, some of the language is kind of stuck in that time capsule before the language of the 70s or early 70s. So, hey, JC, you're all right with me. Okay, fine. But if you listen to some of the other things they're saying and some of the things we learned about Jesus, will you fight for me? So that idea of the Messiah who would be the King Savior who would fight off the enemies of Israel. Jesus, will you die for me? You notice they said that. The suffering Messiah, which nobody was expecting, but of course Jesus suffered and died, which
was a crisis point for his followers because they weren't expecting the Messiah to do that. Anyway, so going back to Jesus, church structures. Ultimately, the church is based on Jesus. He is the ultimate church structure. He is the foundation stone of the church. Remember, and when we looked at the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John, when it talked about the New Jerusalem, the symbol of the New Jerusalem, God and the Lamb, which is a symbol for Jesus, are the center of the city. Okay, they're like the temple, the new temple of the New Jerusalem. But the church has other structures, or other foundation stones that are connected to Jesus. We have the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem, 12 foundation stones with the names of the apostles. So the apostles are seen as foundations of the church, even though Jesus is the central stone, one might say, the central foundation stone. It's also interesting, I thought about this on my drive over, and I guess I wanted to mention it. Notice that also in the book of Revelation, when it describes New Jerusalem, the city has 12 gates, 3 gates on each side of the city. The city's like a big square in a way, square-ish. And the names on those gates are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. I should mention that as well. Why is that important? Because most people who are Christian today are not Jews. Okay, if you had to do a statistical study of Christianity, there are over 2 billion Christians, or people who call themselves Christians in the world. Say like 99.9% are Gentiles. They're people who are outside of the Jewish community. They don't have a Jewish mother. Okay, so they're not part of that community. But that's not where Christianity comes from, as you know. Jesus was a Jew. His mother and father were Jewish. His family was, his extended family was Jewish. His early followers, as far as we know, were Jewish. And it was a Jewish movement. This is a Jewish movement. It comes out of Judaism. And it still is in a way. Even though most believers in Jesus are non-Jews, like myself, I'm Irish, obviously. I'm not a Jew. My people were not worshiping the God of Israel until someone came to Ireland. Maybe it was St. Patrick, that's the tradition. But someone came to my people who were pagans, who were worshiping many gods. They worshiped sacred springs of water, all sorts of stuff. And someone came and preached this message about this Jewish guy for them on the other side of the world, who died on a cross, and their Jewish God, and gave them their Jewish sacred writings, and my people accepted it. They took it over. But the story is, we're part of the Jewish story. I'm part of the Jewish story. This is really about the Jews. Even though you might say, yes, well, the Jews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah now. But hopefully they will. That's a hope, that eventually the church's belief, if you read in the Catechism about the relationship of the church to the Jews, that there is that hope that they will eventually accept Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah of Israel, because he really came for them. And through them, salvation has come to the world. So that's another thing I wanted to highlight in that symbol of the New Jerusalem. The 3 doors, the entrances, you kind of enter through Israel into the church as well. I have come to salvation through the Messiah of the Jews, who is Jesus. He's not the Messiah of the Irish. We didn't come up with that idea. The Jews did. And God revealed himself to them and made his promises to them. But I, as a non-Jew, am a beneficiary of that. So Jesus is the ultimate structure. The apostles are another structure. Jesus gave them power and authority. And the apostles establish other structures that Jesus did not establish. Jesus, if you read the Gospels, you read the Gospel of Mark, Jesus doesn't mention bishops, he doesn't mention priests, he doesn't mention deacons. These come later. These are structures that come from the apostles who established these things as part of continuing the ministry of Jesus. And so we see their development, even in the New Testament. So we looked at Titus, and now we're going to look at Timothy. We see the same kind of stuff going on in the first letter of Timothy, which, as I will remind you, a lot of scholars say, no, Paul did not write this letter to this man Timothy. I don't have a problem believing it is from Paul the Apostle. Traditionally, the church has accepted that it was of apostolic origin, that it does come from Paul the Apostle. So that's fine with me. I think you can argue that it is legitimate. But just so you know, there are a lot of scholars who don't think so. And if you read the sections from 1 Timothy that I asked you, chapter 3 and chapters 3 and chapter 5, there again he talks about these offices of overseer, bishop, and he talks about the office of the presbyter or the priest. And what's interesting about 1 Timothy is that here in the letter, the bishop's and the priest's role is distinguished and treated separately. So are they now becoming already early on distinct offices? I told you before, in the history of ministry, they called them presbyter bishops. Okay, the role of the presbyter and the bishop was not so clearly distinguished, okay? Every church had a bishop, basically. And then eventually the role of the priest, kind of some of the functions of the bishop or overseer were taken out and given to, a lesser functionary called a priest or a presbyter. But here in 1 Timothy, they seem to be already distinguished. And Paul tells this man Timothy what are the qualifications for an overseer. Though he doesn't really give qualifications for the elders, he does list some rules for dealing with elders. Bible here. 1 Timothy. Remember, we encountered this letter, or the letters to Timothy before when we talked about the Bible, because in 2 Timothy, Paul talks about the inspiration of Scripture. Timothy apparently was, a companion of Paul. He also was apparently a young man, because Paul mentions that he is a bishop himself. He's an overseer, and Paul kind of tells him, don't let people look down on you because you're so young. So apparently he was a kind of a youthful guy. He wasn't an older man. So late 20s, early 30s, maybe. Okay, if we guesstimate. So he is already a bishop, and Paul is kind of giving him some advice on how he should act as a bishop. Okay, and that's in the context of which he gives him some specific instructions about qualifications. So, for example, in chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says, "Whoever aspires to the office of overseer or bishop desires a noble task." So this is a good thing. And so a bishop must be irreproachable. So he should be a good guy. He shouldn't be, living a double life. He should be a righteous person. He should not be a hypocrite. Married only once. So remember, he said that in Titus as well, if you remember, that an overseer should be married only once, which means basically that if he is married and his wife dies, he probably shouldn't marry again. That's interesting. Temperate, which means he doesn't overeat and overexert himself, and I shouldn't say overexert himself. He doesn't overeat or overdrink. He's moderate in his desires. Self-controlled, decent, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunk, not aggressive, so he's not a jerk. This is not overpowering with his personality. He's gentle, not contentious, not a lover of money. Well, Paul was writing before the late Middle Ages, so because some of the popes in the 800s and 900s AD, well, they loved the money, and later, anyways. So he should manage his household well, keeping his children under control. So Paul is making this kind of connection between, just like he manages his house well with his wife and his children, he's managing also the household of God. So that's kind of like the imagery that Paul is using here. The church is like a household. It's our home. And he's like the bishop is kind of like our father figure, okay? And he should manage us just as like he would manage his own children, with gentleness and love and stuff like that, okay? All right. Then he gives in verse 8, he gives the conditions for, I stopped at verse 7, but I should have gone to verse 8. He mentions deacons and gives qualifications for deacons, both male and female, interestingly enough. It seems that these offices were mostly reserved to men. Jesus only chose men for the apostles for whatever reason. Could be cultural reasons, okay, that it was a male-dominated society. Possibly there could have been theological reasons, because it's the 12 tribes of Israel come from the sons of Israel, his 12 sons, not his daughters. So there could be theological reasons and ideological reasons, whatever. We don't know. Jesus doesn't say, and the tradition of the church kind of goes with that. Jesus has not given the... Paul assumes that only men should be overseers, only men should be elders. But in the case of deacons, there seems to be some fluidity here because he gives qualifications not just for male deacons or male servants, but also female deacons. What was the role of female deacons? Were they on the same level as male deacons? We don't know, but he does give qualifications. So a female deacon should be dignified, not a slanderer, temperate, also not overindulging in food and drink, faithful in everything. Okay, so he just gives some little instructions on that. So we have specifications. Chapter 5, that's the elders. What does he say about elders? Want to say anything about that? Well, maybe not. Maybe I might say something later about it. But anyway, in chapter 5 is where he gives his rules for elders, who should be good preachers. So I'll just say that. So he emphasizes that aspect of eldership, which is preaching the gospel message. So there is a distinction where he separates out the elders and talks about them later on. So 1 Timothy 4:14. Okay. That's something I want to mention, I think. Yeah, I'll mention it because it will come later in the Sacrament of Holy Orders. In chapter 4, verse 14, he uses this Greek phrase, which I put up here for you, meta epitheseos ton hieron tu presbyteriou, okay, with the laying on of the hands for priesthood, where hieron is the plural of hands, okay. If you ever go to like a chiropractor means one who practices with his or her hands, chiro, okay, so chiro. And presbyteriou, we already know from presbyter, elder. So this is interesting, and will tie into later when I talk about the Sacrament of Holy Orders and how it's passed on. Because with the sacraments, with the passing on of supernatural power, there's usually a material, physical element. It's not just, something. It's just as someone says, okay, now you're an overseer, or now you're baptized. Okay, there's usually a physical element. So in baptism, water is poured over the person and things are said. In the case of holy orders of passing on supernatural, spiritual power, words are said, and there's the laying on of hands. You touch the person as a symbolic way, but also a real way of showing the passing on of supernatural power. And we see that very early on in the life of Jesus. When Jesus heals some people, he touches them when he heals them. But also in passing on the apostolic ministry, Paul mentions this in chapter 4, verse 14, when he says to Timothy, where are we here? Command and teach these things. Okay, he's telling him what Timothy should be teaching. Let no one have contempt for your youth, but set an example for those who believe in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. So an overseer should be a good example. Until I arrive, I guess Paul was going to travel and meet with Timothy at some time, wherever Timothy was, attend to the reading, exhortation, and teaching. You see a little note here, what does he mean by reading? Probably meaning reading the scriptures. So being a student of the Bible and of the scriptures and knowing the message of God, exhorting people, which would be preaching and also teaching people. Do not neglect the gift you have, which was conferred on you through the prophetic word, the word of prophecy, with the imposition of hands of the presbyterate, or of the priesthood. Okay, and that's what he's saying here. That you had hands laid on you, you had the spiritual power passed on to you through the laying on of hands. So it's more than just some office that someone gives to someone. Okay, you've been elected a bishop, and so now you're a bishop. No, it's a more formal process where it's not you are made a bishop just like Jesus made the apostles. There's something going on here, a creative act going on here. It's something special. It's not like you hire somebody for the job. Okay, it's a serious position. Okay. The Didache. I wanted to mention the Didache because, like the letter to the Romans, or the letter of the Romans to the Corinthians, which may have been written by Pope St. Clement in the 90s, we also discovered in the 1800s this very early document. I think they knew about it before. They knew its name, but no one had found the document, actually. And then someone realized in the 1800s they were reading some manuscript, and they're like, wait a second, this is actually the document. It was embedded within a longer work, and people thought it was just one unified work. And then someone realized, well, no, actually, this document has been added to it. It's a separate work all of itself. And this work is called the Didache, or the Didache Didache, is it in Greek? Dodeskalon. I don't want to screw up my Greek. Dodeskalon Apostolon, something like that. But in English, it means the teaching of the 12 apostles. The teaching of the 12 apostles. Shorthand in Greek, it's called the Didache, or teaching. And this is an important document because just like First Clement, or the letter of the Romans to the Corinthians, it's very early. It dates from the 90s. Put that on the PowerPoint. It dates from the 90s AD, so around the time, maybe even a little earlier than First Clement. So it's from the New Testament period. It's from the time, just like First Clement, when some of the New Testament writings may have not even been written yet. So it gives us a snapshot of what was going on in early Christianity. And just to kind of counterbalance it and contrast it with the New Testament to show you that, yeah, we do have historical evidence outside of the New Testament showing that these kind of church structures were already developing. So the New Testament, these things were going on. I just give you this little quote from the Didache in chapter or number 15. Where it talks about bishops and deacons. Notice it does not talk about elders. It doesn't talk about elders. So again, we're at the early stages here where you have presbyter bishops. You have presbyter bishops where the functions are kind of combined in the overseer, and the functions of the elders have not been separated out yet. So what is the Didache? We don't know who wrote the Didache. It says it's the teaching of the 12 apostles. It's almost certainly not. It's not a record of the actual teaching of the 12 apostles. But it claims to be, it's basically giving instructions to early Christians about various things, how to act, how to live their life. It gives instructions on the Eucharist, the Mass, how to celebrate the Mass. And it gives instructions about leadership. And it says, appoint for yourselves bishops and deacons, overseers and servants, worthy of the Lord, meek, gentle men, not lovers of money. So notice kind of like the crossover with Paul's sentiments in Titus and Timothy, where this idea that you don't want lovers of money, so that's a concern. They should be truthful and approved. Okay, so you're not just hiring any Joe Blow off the street. You want to make sure that these people have a good reputation. For they, the bishops and deacons, also minister to you the ministry of the prophets and teachers, the prophets. So, kind of making a connection to Judaism with the messengers God sent to his people, the prophets. So notice that the connection, the bishops or the overseers are kind of in a prophetic role. They're kind of like the prophets of old that God would send to Israel to remind the Israelites of their covenant relationship, their contract with God, and how they should be living. So don't despise them. For they are your honorable men together with the prophets and teachers. Okay, so anyways. So we see, yeah, we have evidence that these church structures, we see in the New Testament, we see in early Christian literature that these church structures are there almost from the beginning. And so in a later, actually I might skip over Lumen Gentium. I might want to get to St. Ignatius. Well, no, I want to talk about it because it could. What is the role of the bishop or the overseer? We have this description in Lumen Gentium. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I've already stated. I'm looking at the quote, and I've already pretty much gone over this, so I'm not gonna waste my time with that. Sorry about that. Skip the St. Ignatius of Antioch. We have evidence as well from another early Christian writer, a man named St. Ignatius of Antioch, and he's important. He's important because he is early. You can see his dates. He lived from around 50 A.D. and he died in 117 A.D. And he wrote a series of letters to Christian communities. Why? Well, why is that? Why is that important to Christian history or to his life? Let me tell you why. Go to our map here. Okay. The ancient Mediterranean. Ignatius of Antioch was from a city that was around here in ancient Syria. So he was a Syrian gentleman from the Eastern Mediterranean, and he was a Christian, which at that time in the Roman Empire was, you could say it was illegal. Okay, that's probably not exactly the right term to use, but basically, the Christian movement in the early years, how do I put this? There was no separation of church and state. Okay, that's a modern idea. People didn't think that way. And in a lot of cultures, okay, it's a very modern idea that you separate government and the society from the supernatural. In the ancient world of this time, the two were just mixed together. People didn't think in those terms. So, it was part of being a Roman citizen, or a part of any of society was meant you worship the gods of the society. And to not do that could be causing problems, because if you didn't worship the gods of the society, the gods that were supposedly protecting your group, then if anyone didn't do that or says, "Hey, I'm not going to do that," you could make the gods angry, and the gods could harm you. They could send a plague. They could make your women infertile so they don't give birth to children, or they give birth to deformed children. They could kill your animals or cause a drought because, Bob over there doesn't want to worship us. All right? So that's how people kind of looked at things, and they had no mindset that government and religion were different things. So in the government, say the Roman Empire, you worshiped the emperor, of course, and it was all over the place. You went to court, you had to burn incense to the gods or take oaths by the gods that you would tell the truth. You go to the temples for the holidays. Sporting events were usually dedicated to some god or something. So it was all over the place. No one thought anything about it. But you were supposed to worship the gods because they were the ones who protected your group. Well, you had two groups that were kind of special at this time. The Jews were always special because, and people didn't like the Jews in the Roman Empire. The Jews were looked down upon. Why? Because they wouldn't worship the gods of Rome. They wouldn't worship the local gods of the community. They would only worship this one God that they believed in. They were the Jews are very passionate about that. Okay, so they were known for that. They would only follow the revelation of their own God. And so Jews had certain kind of accommodations within the Roman Empire, like, they didn't have to maybe serve in the military or go to court and stuff because they couldn't participate in the pagan rituals. So they were a special group. The Christians were not. The Christians were a new movement related to Judaism. They also would not worship the pagan gods of the society because they were basically Jews. They believed in the one God of Judaism. And so they were seen kind of as traitors. They were seen as disloyal. And if you were traitorous or disloyal to the society, you would be executed. That was just it. I mean, there was very harsh treatment. If anything you do to disrupt the society and cause chaos or anarchy or threaten the existence of the group, usually in a lot of societies, this was not unusual, you were dead or you were exiled. They kicked you out, which meant you were basically dead because you're kicked out into nature and you had to take care of yourself, survive on your own without the group. So Ignatius was a Christian. So sometimes people will say, well, Christianity was kind of illegal. Okay, in a manner of speaking, yes, it was not a tolerated belief system like the Jews. The Jews were kind of tolerated because their religion was old, so the Romans respected tradition, and there were enough Jews throughout the empire that they were important enough that they could make some toleration. But no other groups had this right. Certainly not the Christians. So Ignatius was a Christian, and he was asked, are you going to worship the gods of Rome? He said, no, I'm a Christian. Okay, well then you die. You're going to be executed. So he was going to be sent, even though he was from Syria over here. He was put on a boat, and he was being sent all the way over to the city of Rome, which for some reason is not on the map, even though it's the capital of the country of Italy. I don't understand. They have Florence, but they don't have Rome. Whatever. Monaco, which is not a city, but it's about a country. So, and he was going to be transported all the way over to Rome, where he would be executed. I mean, he was already judged. I mean, he was guilty. He admitted he was a Christian. He was not going to worship the false gods of Rome. So he's going over to Rome to be killed. On the boat, as he's going along, he writes several letters to Christian communities, Christian churches along the way, basically telling them, to keep the faith. Okay, don't worry about me. I'm going to die for Christ. I know I'm going to be killed by lions, and because that's usually how they did these things. Usually, you died in a gory manner. They didn't just give you the electric chair or a needle in your arm. They usually brought you to like an amphitheater, and people showed up with popcorn, and they say, okay, bring out the Christians, and they would bring out wild animals and stuff like that, and they'd have to see them all torn apart and stuff like that. So he knew he was going to die a gory death. So he was sending these letters to local Christian communities saying, don't worry about me, I'm going to God, I've got my faith, you keep the faith as well. So, his letters have historical importance. They're early, probably around the 100s AD they were written. It tells us something about early Christian belief, what Christians were believing about God, about Jesus, about the Eucharist, the Mass, he mentions that. But it also tells us about authority structures, because he's big on bishops. He's big on authority structures. And he writes this. Does anyone want to read this from his letter to the Smyrnians? Actually, I should have kept the map. Sorry about that. Just go back to my map quickly. Smyrnia. Oh, thank you, Google. They actually have the modern city of Izmir marked. It's right here, Smyrnia. Ancient Smyrnia. There's a Christian community there in Turkey. He wrote a letter called the Letter to the Smyrnians. God bless you. Now, you have to be careful with Ignatius's letters because they're like Paul's letters. They're authentic letters and inauthentic, that people wrote later. Smyrnians is one of the authentic ones, so we're okay with it. It almost certainly comes from Ignatius. Does anyone want to read this quote from Ignatius of Antioch? Mr. Grimaldi. Yes? No?
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Mr. Grimaldi. Thank you for saying that with a smile. Go ahead, sir.
See that you all follow the Father, prophet, wherever the bishop shall appear there,
Excellent, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay. So he's big on church structure. We know that he mentions it in other letters as well. So he makes this connection between following the bishop just as Jesus followed the Father, which is interesting because he's placing the bishop in the position of God, which you have to be careful with when you do that with any human being. Okay, you still have to remember they're not God; they're human beings. Nevertheless, but he's speaking metaphorically. He's not saying that the bishop is actually a god or should be treated like a god, but he's making like the connection of just as Jesus was obedient to his Father's will, you as Christian followers, you've been left the overseer, kind of in that you're kind of in that position of obedience to the overseer. This person has an important position. Oh, notice we have, and again, this is probably written around the 100s AD. So again, New Testament times for some portions of the New Testament. And we do have a distinction here. We have a distinction between overseer, a presbyter, and the deacons. And they all should be reverenced as being the institution of God. And I have a question mark there because I wonder, what does that mean as the institution of God? Does it mean that it's a sacrament, that it's something that Jesus gave the church to perpetuate and continue on the ministry that he had? It's an ambiguous term, but we start seeing this idea that this is part of the foundation of the church. It's an institution, and it's not just a human institution. It didn't just arise because of sociological circumstances. It's a divine institution. It's an institution that comes from God. Notice what you can't do, or you can and can't do without the bishop. The celebration of the Mass, of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. Okay? The Lord's Supper should not be celebrated without the permission or the presence of the bishop, or to those to whom he's entrusted it, which later will mean the priests. The priests will be entrusted mainly with that task. And where the bishop appears, there is the Catholic Church. So just as Jesus, where the bishop appears, the presence of Jesus is there. Because Jesus is the foundation of authority which transfers to the apostles, which the apostles are transferred to the bishops. So it's as if Jesus is there. And when Jesus is there, there is the Catholic Church. This is another reason why Ignatius is important to Christian history, because he's the first one to use this phrase, the Catholic Church. Which he doesn't use in a specific way. He's not talking about like the Roman Catholic Church, okay? Although the Catholic Church still uses this terminology, which is very ancient, as you can see. Catholic just simply means universal. It's a Greek word. So universal or worldwide, katholikos in Greek, which comes from, two Greek words, which means according to the whole. Okay, according to the whole, or the whole thing. The whole ball of wax, we might say. So it's literally the universal church, or the worldwide church. This is the church that is spreading throughout the world. Lord Ignatius' time, Christianity was very, very small. It really wasn't worldwide. But give it time, right? So he uses this term, the Catholic Church, and that kind of stuff, okay? And now it's just applied to the Roman Catholic Church mainly, but so it's ancient terminology for the community. Baptizing, and he mentions these love feasts, which are not exactly the same as the Lord's Supper. They were kind of like communal meals that Christians would hold, and then they might celebrate the Lord's Supper after them. But these meals kind of, they're mentioned in the New Testament, actually. Paul talks about them in the letters to the Corinthians, and usually there were problems associated with them, so they kind of discontinued them pretty quickly. Christians, people would show up drunk. Yeah. People would hoard their own food and wouldn't share it with others. They were Christians. What you'd expect from Christians, So these agape feasts or love feasts that he mentions were an early practice. They were not of community building, but they died out pretty quickly because just there's so many problems with them. And the last comment he makes, reverencing God and the bishop. Oh no, excuse me, wrong place. But whosoever he shall approve of, namely the bishop, that is also pleasing to God. so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. So order, orderliness, structure, holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders is what some people call it. How do you make a person a bishop or a priest or a deacon? You ordain them. You bring them into orders because they bring order and structure to the church. Okay, so we see that idea already very early on in a understanding, a theology, you might say, of church structure. And it continues to this day. I mean, that's the valid church structure for the Catholic Church. When it looks at other Christian denominations, it looks for this structure. So, for example, Eastern Christians like Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, etc., they have this structure, this traditional ancient structure of bishops, priests, and deacons. Other communities do not. They've gotten rid of it. Lutherans still have this. There are Lutheran bishops in some communities, but not all communities. Episcopalians have it, bishop, priest, deacon. Although their orders are not considered valid by the Catholic Church, they've kind of lost elements of the faith. But other groups, like, say, Baptist churches, might have elders, but they don't really have bishops or deacons. They might have deacons as well, but they usually don't have bishops. Presbyterians, they got rid of bishops. They divided up the office of bishop, overseer, and gave it each to elders. So you have, for example, with Presbyterians, you have elders of word and sacrament, who are kind of like priests. They deal with the Lord's Supper, but you also have teaching elders who are more preachers. And you have governing elders who are more like bishops. They make all the rules and decisions. So they kind of divide it up. Then you've got congregationalists who are no bishops, no elders, maybe no deacons. It's just the congregation. We are the priests. So the church looks at that. The Catholic Church will look at that and say, well, they don't have that structure anymore. They've lost it. So they've lost something essential to what is the church, what is the ecclesia. So it's very important, as I think we can see from the history of the church. Where does the Pope fit into all of this? So I'm going to give just a brief discussion of the papacy. I don't know if I'll hit every point on the PowerPoint. No pun intended, Ms. Thornburg. I gotta make my own fun, Mr. Diggs. I don't know how much I'll talk about the Pope, because I don't want to kind of go down a rabbit hole with it, but I do think I need to talk about him because he is a major part of Christian faith, certainly of the Catholic faith. I want this. Hold on one second. I'm just looking at my notes here. I don't know if I want to talk about this. Maybe I do want to talk about this. All right. As the Messiah, as the Christ, Jesus is a sacred figure. He is a figure that is set apart from the normal and the everyday. I mean, the Messiah was this figure who was supposed to come at the end of time and establish God's kingdom. So you'll notice right there, it's God's kingdom. So you're already talking about a supernatural figure. So Jesus is a sacred and supernatural figure. He's Israel's savior sent by God. And certainly as God's son, he's a sacred figure. He's God in the flesh, Emmanuel, God with us, okay? And so this sacred person established a structured community that we call the church. And because the church is established by a sacred person, a supernatural person, the church, by implication, is also supernatural and sacred. It's not just any human organization, although it's made up of humans, so it has to operate that way, Someone at the Vatican has to answer the phone. You know what I'm saying? It's just the way it is. You gotta raise money. You need a new roof for the church. You gotta pass the hat around or the Beretta or whatever and raise your money, because you're not going to get it from the local government. Separation of church and state, although not in all countries. So, you have to go through the usual things of any group to keep the group going. But that doesn't mean that because there are these natural realities that there aren't supernatural things going on as well, because ultimately the church derives from a supernatural entity.
Within the structured community, Jesus gave, as I told you, some people for his own decision. I don't know why he chose certain people and didn't choose others, why he chose certain sexes and didn't choose others. I don't know. I wasn't there, but he gave some power of his own power and authority to some people, and specifically the apostles. And because it's his authority, it's sacred authority. And so some people in the church have that sacred authority. We call this idea hierarchy. Which is simply a fancy term for sacred authority. The word hieros in Greek means sacred or holy, something dedicated to the gods. Arche comes from the Greek word arche, which means, well, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean foundation, it can mean first principle, beginning of something. But a sacred foundation, but I'd say sacred authority is probably the best translation I could give it. I don't give you a definition on the PowerPoint, but if I did, I'd say sacred authority, the exercise of sacred authority, sacred power, you might say. And you know these words already, maybe not hieros, but you know arche, from monarchy, the rule of one person. Architect, someone who's an architect is, we know this from tectone with Jesus, carpenter, right? Woodworker. From the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is called a tectone. So these two words, arche and tect, one who builds on foundations, like an architect does, builds buildings. So there's hierarchy, there's sacred power. And one is made part of this hierarchy through ordination. You are ordered to it through ordination, the laying on of hands that I told you about, that Paul describes in the first letter of Timothy. And this seems to be essential to the passing on of authority. Again, why? Why couldn't you do something else? Why couldn't, someone just blow in the guy's face to give him authority, or just give him a letter saying, "Here, I give you authority"? I don't know. It is symbolic in a lot of ways, but it is seen as essential, the laying on of hands for the sacrament. And so a person who receives it has it by right. So the bishop in the church structure, he is first, the overseer is first, because it's the bishop who receives the fullness of sacred power and authority. Okay? As I told you my definition of what a bishop is. Because it is the bishop, the overseer, who is the successor to the apostles. Okay, so you have Jesus, you have the apostles, which Jesus chose. There's a distinction there. They have the same powers and authority, or I should say some of the same powers and authority that Jesus get from Jesus. And then they pass on those same power and authorities to others. But these others are not apostles themselves. They're a distinct group, and they're called overseers. But they have the fullness of the same authority. So power, when we talk about this, people might think, well, power, and power is a bad thing. Okay? Power is not per se evil or bad. It's just the ability, power is the ability to do something. It's all power means. It's the ability to do something, to exert control, make something happen. So it's not by definition something evil or bad. God has power and God is good by definition, or by nature, we should say. And why is this power given? It's not just power for the sake of power, okay? Which can be a bad thing. People who just do, and you can see this like if you're on the internet and you've ever been manipulated on the internet. You clickbait, It's like, Taylor Swift has big news to tell, Oh, I gotta click on that. I gotta know, And why is the New York Times so fascinated about whether Taylor's actually gay or not? I don't know, I know she's going out with that guy Kelce, right? Travis Kelce, but why is it any of their business? Why do they have reporters like on the? But that's clickbait. People will read. I got to read the New York Times. I got to go on the website, see what Taylor is. She isn't she? What's going on? So they have power over you. They make you do things, at least click the mouse, And sometimes it can be manipulative. Sometimes it can be very manipulative and bad. Okay? And that's a problem for the church than no less for any human organization. I mean, just think in the past several decades, I mean, where you had the sexual abuse scandals. Multiple times, not just one time, but there were multiple ones going back to the 1980s. A lot of times it was an abuse of power. Bishops had power and they could cover up things because they had the ability to do that. So power for the sake of just having power can be a bad thing. But this is not what it should be for an overseer. It's to be exercised in service so that all of us can get to heaven. That's the whole purpose of what the overseer's job is. Even the Pope's job. It's not power for the sake of power, but it's for all of us to get to heaven, to get to the presence of God, to help, to lift, kind of like the old saying that, rising water lifts all boats. Okay? That it's as much for the salvation of the bishop to get him to heaven as for him to help you get to heaven. Okay? There is maybe some self-interest there, if you want to say. So what is the hierarchy's purpose? And this is from the Catechism. I think I had you read it, but I just want to... There are three purposes that Christ, Christ gives to his apostles, and it still continues in the hierarchy, no less for the Pope than for any other bishop. And the purposes, because I've talked about a lot the structure and what the structure is and where it comes from and how it's developed. But what is it? I mean, maybe now I'm talking more about what it is, I should say. But I've talked about the history of the structure. But there are three purposes. First, to teach, then to govern, and finally to sanctify, to make holy. So to tell people what needs to be believed as a Christian, because people want to know. I mean, sometimes the church or any religion gets a bad rap for, they're telling me what to do and stuff like that. Well, yeah, but people have questions. People sometimes want to know what to do. Well, what does the church say about this? What does the church say about that? Can I believe in biological evolution, or, is it wrong? Is abortion right or wrong? What should I think about? Is the world, well, that wouldn't actually be a theological question, but anyways, is there alien life? What does the church teach about Bigfoot, Ms. Rarick? Actually, I met Bigfoot once, and did you know? He's a Christian. He's not Catholic. He's a Methodist.
He's been saved.
No, because he's a Methodist. So he's still going to burn in hell. Not a Catholic.
He's also.
I'm just kidding. Big situation. I gotta see who's still listening to me this morning. Anyhow, so that's just that's a natural thing. I mean, that you teach, people want to know. They want to know about their faith sometimes. What can I do? Can I, how do I get married in the church, or what? Can I get my kids baptized? It's part of the teaching of it. Then governing. As I said, someone has to answer the phone. Someone has to lick the stamps and put them on the letter. Someone has to remove a priest if he's doing goofy stuff, if he's not talked about the sexual scandals, Governing. Sometimes, if a priest is doing bad things, you have to discipline him. Or, you have to run the diocese. Someone has to take care of the money, sell property, buy property, do this. So governing is a part of it. And then finally, and I guess one of the more important things is to make us all holy, to make us good, righteous people, to do good things, to help the poor, to help people who are drug addicted, to help people who have problems, people who are homeless, help try and give them homes, or people who are starving, give them food. So sanctifying. These are the three things that are the purpose of the hierarchy. This is what it's all about. And if the church forgets this, any one of these, then it should just go away. It should, and that's why maybe in some cases it's dying in some places. Because, the church might have a lot of social programs in some areas, but they forget to teach. They forget to teach the faith. Okay, that's great. You have homeless shelters and stuff. You're doing the work of Christ, but you don't talk about Christ. You don't talk about, not that you're going to preach at people, I'm not saying that, or push things on people, but that you're still open, that this is like what we're about. This is what's motivating us for doing what we're doing. And we see this again with Jesus. And I'm not going to beat a dead horse because I already talked about Matthew chapter 10. But remember when we talked about it, when Jesus commissions in the Gospel of Matthew, he sends the apostles out on mission. He gives them his own powers. And he tells them to preach the kingdom of God. So you have teaching. Okay, he tells them to make governing decisions, like deciding where they're going to stay in the town, with which person, which kind of person, and sanctifying. He giving blessings to people, blessing the house that they go into that welcomes them, which is a supernatural thing. You want me saying, God, do good things to these people. So we see this threefold ministry already in the ministry of Jesus and what he tells the apostles to do. And it's just been extended to the church. So where does the Pope fit in all of this? Okay, that is wrong. I think that's right on the PowerPoint. My notes are wrong, actually. I think we have Pope Francis would then be 266. But check me out. Someone wants an extra credit point. Check me out on that. I think there have been 266 popes officially. It depends on how you count them. Okay, because especially in the early days of the Roman papacy, like I talked about Clement, was he truly a pope? He was a bishop, yes, but there were a number of bishops of the Diocese of Rome at the time, and they kind of shared authority. But he's considered a pope, a single pope. Okay, so it depends on how you count them. But what the official list is, I think it's 266. If someone wants to.
266.
Yeah, why not? Thank you. 266. Popes. Okay. Pope Francis is the 266th. So make sure I don't forget before I... And let me tell you something. I don't know if anyone's ever going to go to Hollywood. I don't know if you're like acting or like writing and want to be a scriptwriter or whatever. But I gotta tell you, let me just throw an idea out there for like Netflix or for Hulu or for whatever, Apple TV. If you ever want to have like a great mini series, one filled with sex and violence and all sorts of stuff. Not that I'm promoting that. I shouldn't do that, I guess. But just do a history of the popes. Yeah, 266 of them. And they got tons of weirdo stuff that goes on with the popes. Some of them are very good popes, and some of them are very saintly, so you're not going to get much out of that. And some of them are kind of boring. Actually, a lot are kind of boring. Some of them are real rabble-rousers. Really got into a lot of trouble and did stir things up. Anyways, and you might make a lot of money off of it. I'm not advocating sex and violence, by the way, but I'm just saying. And if you do that and make some money off of it, send a little Dr. Dunn's way. At least pay off my student loans, Mr. Malone, Mr. Kushner, Anyways, so there have been 266 popes. What's the definition of the Pope? The Pope is a title. He's actually the Bishop of Rome. He is a bishop in and of himself. He's not above the bishops. He's amongst the bishops, okay? Even though he can sometimes be treated like he's above the bishops. But he's really not. He's a part of the whole structure of bishops. He's not really separate. But the Pope is a title given to the Bishop of Rome in his position as the successor of Peter the Apostle and earthly head of the Catholic Church. Ultimately, Jesus is always the head of the church. And the term pope comes from the Greek word, or actually Latin papa, which comes from Greek papas, which means a father figure. It can also mean like daddy, okay? And in the early days, originally the term pope was used for any bishop. All bishops were called papas, were called fathers. Just like priests are called fathers in the same way. You're basically, if you translate father into pope, father really is pope and comes to be pope from Greek, you're kind of doing that already, continuing that tradition when you talk about, Father Smith, Pope Smith in a way is what you're saying. And all bishops were called popes. So that tradition kind of continues of calling a religious figure a father in a way. And it still is in use, even though most bishops don't go by the term pope, except for the Bishop of Rome. It becomes restricted to the Bishop of Rome eventually, but other Christians do. So, for example, they're not Catholics, they're not united with the Catholic Church, but the Coptic Church in Egypt Coptic Orthodox Christians, the head of their church is called the Pope. So they continue this ancient tradition of calling their leader a pope or a papas, a father figure. He's now Tawadros II, I believe, Pope of Egypt, of the Coptic Church in all Egypt. When did that happen? Around the 500s. Around the 500s, the term pope became specifically reserved in the West to the Bishop of Rome. But ultimately, what you're saying when you say, Pope Francis, is you're saying like Father Smith, Father Francis. Okay, same kind of tradition. And so the papacy is the name for that office and the jurisdiction. Okay, so pope is the person, the title of the person, and then the papacy is the office. Where do we get the papacy from, this idea? Okay, well, we have an idea from Scripture, from the Bible, because as I told you or showed you in the definition, the main thing that defines the Bishop of Rome amongst the other bishops and makes the Bishop of Rome special is the Roman Church's connection to Simon Peter, the apostle. Actually, two apostles. The main focus is on Simon Peter, but also Paul. Okay, so both of these dudes, but mainly especially Simon Peter. And Rome was the place where they spent their last days. Eventually, Simon Peter ended up in Rome. Also, Paul ended up in Rome, and they both were killed there for the faith. But especially Simon Peter had a connection with the church in Rome. He was there for however long before he was killed for the faith. And so the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, is seen as kind of the successor to his authority amongst the apostles. Even though we know there were Christians in Rome before Simon got there, there was already a Christian community. He probably did not found the community, as later tradition would say. It's kind of legendary. But when he did arrive, his influence as being the first amongst the apostles, the closest to Jesus, it was very special that he was there, and especially that he ended his life there dying for the faith. And so it was seen that his authority had kind of transferred to the Bishop of Rome. So since Peter had a connection to the Roman Church and even died there, it's part of Rome's identity and the Bishop of Rome's identity. It's how the church sees herself in the context of Peter's relationship to Jesus. And what is that relationship? Well, let's look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 or 13 to 18. Does anyone want to read that for us? Matthew chapter 16, 13 to 18. 13 to 18. Anybody? It's supposed to smell right here? Mom said it smelled. It smelled yesterday. Da-da-da-da. How we doing? Anybody? You got it? I know you got it, but I don't want to keep calling on the same people and give other people a chance. Anyways, Ms. Spence, go ahead.
Simon Peter said, replied.
Oh, hold on. Verse 13, please.
Oh, I think it's 16.
I'm sorry. Yes, 13.
When Jesus went to the region of
Caesarea.
Caesarea,
Philippi.
he asked his disciples, "Do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said to God, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, or
Jonah.
Joseph.
That's all right.
Flesh and blood has not revealed this this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall loose lost in heaven. When he strictly ordered his disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah.
All right, thank you. That's it. Verse 20 of the PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, so this is a very famous episode, at least in talking about the papacy. Those of you who have read Mark's Gospel, remember in chapter 8 that this story is told, and you might notice that Matthew has expanded on it with extra material that he has. It's rather short in Mark's Gospel, but here it's longer. And Matthew tells us where they were when this episode happened. It's a place called modern-day Banias in northern Israel, in case you want to know. It was apparently pagan territory. It was not a largely Jewish territory. And Jesus, just like in Mark's Gospel, asks, it's like who do the people say? Who do the crowds think I am? And you get a number of responses. John the Baptist, who by this time was already dead, apparently. So that's kind of weird, because you have the sense of already kind of broaching the topic of resurrection, like Jesus and John were contemporaries, so how could he be John the Baptist? John the Baptist was alive at the same time. Then he was dead, you know? So people have this superstitious idea, okay, Jesus is like John, come back from the dead, or he's one of the prophets. He's just a prophet. He's Elijah. Remember, Elijah was supposed to come at the end of the world to announce the Messiah, so he's like Elijah, bringing about the end of the world. And so finally, Jesus says, who do you say me to be, is how he literally says it in the Greek. And Simon Peter, notice he's already called Peter, interestingly enough, in Matthew's Gospel. Simon Peter says, you are the Christ, but it says more than that, more than Mark says, you are the Son of the living God. And if you read the Catechism, the Church sees this as an expression that he's not just the Christ, the Messiah figure, but he's more than that. He's almost a divine figure. He's the Son of the God who is alive, the living God. Okay? And Jesus blesses him for that statement of faith in who he believes Jesus is. Jesus, and apparently, even though Jesus doesn't say, yes, I'm the Messiah, call me the Messiah, okay, as I've told you before, Jesus didn't normally talk that way. But by blessing Peter, he's obviously giving an affirmative response, like, yeah, you're right. Okay, he blesses Peter, but he says more to Simon than that. He changes his name. He first tells him, notice that you didn't come up with this by yourself. This was a revelation to you from God. Somehow God inspired Peter to understand this. And he alone amongst the apostles. Notice the 11 don't say nothing. They give, the responses of the crowd. And when Jesus says, well, who do you think I am? It's crickets. It's not like they all jumped up and said, oh, you're the Christ. Only this one guy had the courage to say this, what he believed. He didn't necessarily know, but he believed it. And Jesus says, you're right. God has revealed this to you. And because of that, he confers a special power on Peter that Jesus doesn't say anywhere to the other 11 apostles. Even though they're truly apostles, he gives Peter this power. And he indicates that by changing his name from Simon, you're now going to be called Simon the Rock. Simon the Rock. He gives him the Greek name Petros or Peter. Which we know, and I give you the quote here from the Gospel of John, we have the same scene in a different context in the Gospel of John where Jesus first meets Peter, and Jesus says to him, Andrew, Peter's brother, brought Simon to Jesus. Jesus looked at Simon and said, you are Simon the son of John. I thought he was the son of Jonah. Wasn't he the son of Jonah, Ms. Civarelli? And did we just, well, no matter. Anyways,
Simon, the son of John, you will be called Cephas, which John in his gospel tells us is translated Peter. So John very helpfully gives us what the original Aramaic word was, which is kephah, which means a stone or a rock. So he says, you are now going to be called the rock. And he continues the metaphor. On this rock I will build my church. And Christians have debated and come up with different interpretations of what this means. What does this mean for the church? And maybe I'll get more involved with that, so I'll save it for our next class next week. So I'll stop here, but we'll talk more about what that means that Jesus changes his name to the rock.
Yeah.
Have a good day, miss. Thank you. Have a good weekend. Have a good day, sir. Oh, wait, let me see. Have a good day, gentlemen. Thank you. Mr. Grimaldi was here. He came in late. Kushner. Malone.
Well, I wanted to talk about Quiz 3. I did that last night.
Okay, good.
I somewhat agree. I somewhat agree on in this 30. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Don't tell. Maybe we should. Here, let's talk out in the hallways. We're not.
I'm comfortable with that. It's just I hate stress. I'm driving one here on hill, one here on twisted. That took me, bro. It's so wow. So hurt. But it's okay. Everything's okay.
Yeah.
Oops. Better turn this off. Hold on a second here.